Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes to see if anyone else is joining, and then we will get started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm forward in time, so it is my evening now. Yeah, what does the future look like? I mean, that is a good question about social change, isn't it? So spring weather started to kick in the Northern Hemisphere.
It was very summery actually a couple of weeks
Oh,
ago.
really? It's
Yeah,
gone straight to summer.
yeah, but today is a little fresher.
Oh,
Oh, it's bad for you, Evangelos.
no.
Okay, everyone, thank you for waiting just one more minute, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we can go ahead and start. Um, Thank you everybody for being here. This is the second session of a series of sessions I'm organizing to develop methods for a research project on social change and inertia in the Middle East and Southeast Asia with Diala Howie and Joshua Oiheng and Ammar Shamaili. The series is funded by the British Academy with support from University of Greenwich's Institute for Life Course Development Center for Inequalities. I'm Fouad Zeineddine, in case you don't know, lecturer at the University of Greenwich, and your host today. I won't talk more about my work today. I plan on letting us all learn from our speakers over the coming year. Then I'll present my thoughts on the series and my plans to integrate and use these methods to you all as the concluding session of the series early next year. I want to thank every speaker who's offered their time and effort to this series, sometimes without knowing who I was or what the heck I was up to with all of this. And special thanks, of course, to Emma for being here today. Before we begin, I would like for us to take a moment's silence in sorrow and respect and solidarity with all the peoples continuing to suffer genocide and ecocide across the globe and all the other crises we're attempting to understand and address with our work. Thank you. So today's speaker is Emma Thomas, professor and deputy director of the Jeff Bleich Center for Democracy and Disruptive Technology at Flinders University. Her work focuses on understanding when, why, and how people commit to engaging in violent and nonviolent action to bring about a desired social change. Thanks again, Emma, for volunteering your time to tell us about your work. Um, Please type your questions in the Q&A or the chat, or if you're using an older browser, just use the chat throughout the session. We'll call on people if you raise your hands to ask questions on screen or after the presentation, and throughout I'll also read out your questions whenever Emma is taking questions. So today's session has automated captioning in multiple languages. If you're more comfortable in a language other than English, just turn on the captions and change the language setting on the top right of the captions bar to your preferred language if it's available. The session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube and our archives. I'll provide the links at the end. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Emma. We're really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Do I need to click record or anything, or you've already?
We're all set.
We're all set? Okay. Well, look, I wanted to start honestly by really thanking you for this opportunity and what a wonderful initiative this is. And I have already learned a lot from the first session we've had, and I'm looking forward to following along and then learning from you as well at the end. So congratulations on your award, and thank you again for inviting me to be here. I also wanted to start by acknowledging that I am coming to you today from the ancestral lands of the Kaurna people, and in Australia we've been, having a big debate about how the sort of historical access of our First Nations people are recognised, and that went particularly badly actually in the last year or so. So it's sort of more important than ever to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Kaurna land. And the title of the talk that I have prepared for you, I was going to say this evening, but of course it's not evening for most of you, I imagine. It's morning, is actually drawing on a bunch of work I've done in the last 10 years or so. And the title is Distinguishing Sympathizers, Slacktivists, Rusted on Activists and Radicals. And really it's kind of got a methods theme around using person-centered analyses in collective action research and what that can tell us about how the landscape of collective action and social change can be represented using these different forms of methods. So I'm going to start with some probably fairly obvious observations to many of you, which is that there's been this sort of explosive growth in the emergence, spread and reach of mass protest. And this growth in protest, this kind of prevalence of it in our kind of increasingly in our daily lives and in every corner of the world. This isn't just anecdotal. We're not just paying more attention to it perhaps because we're interested in studying it and understanding it. There are formal analyses that have shown that, for example, an analysis conducted by Ortiz and colleagues on the global protest movement showed that between 2006 and 2020, the advent of these kinds of big moments of contention had more than tripled. Every region in the world had seen an increase with some of the biggest kind of mass mobilizations ever seen. And of course, in terms of the kinds of language that I use, and I know many of us assembled here in the online room this evening, we talk about this as people who are taking collective action. And that is efforts by large numbers of people who define themselves and are defined by others as a group to solve collectively a problem they feel they have in common and which is perceived to arise from their relations with other groups. And so I really like this definition of collective action. It's probably a less commonly used one. And the reason I like this definition of collective action might become more obvious in a moment. But really, if you could just for a minute take note there of the emphasis on, this kind of groupiness of collective action, which is, of course, is so important to so many of our definitions and the theories and things that we work with. And of course, alongside the explosive growth of collective action, there's been this growth of research into collective action. So this is a publication trend that was in an article that Danny and Osborne and I wrote a few years ago, really just showing this kind of steep trajectory of interest into collective action, and that, unsurprisingly, again, I know for everyone in the room, is because of its consequential nature. So this is a key way that people achieve justice and change for disadvantaged groups and alongside disadvantaged groups in society. So there's been this kind of real energy around understanding the drivers of people who engage in collective action, perhaps less around how that might actually translate into social change, which is something that I think we could talk more about, and which is why I find this series so exciting. But much of that kind of research endeavour has sought to address what I've talked about here as two big questions. So the first is, well, why do some people act while others don't? And so here in the literature on these topics, we might talk about activists or protesters versus people who are perhaps sympathetic but don't act, or we might talk about bystanders, or people who are inert, that is, or even apathetic, I guess I would say. So understanding the drivers of action has been one kind of major area of inquiry within this literature. And then the second is, well, why do some people adopt more radical, that is, illegal or violent tactics, where others do not? And here we use words and in categories like activists versus radicals, radicals versus terrorists. And so we've developed these categories to talk about things that differentiate people in terms of their tactical choices. So some observations about these two big questions, or the two big questions as I put them anyway, is that they are about people. And of course, that sounds like a really stupid observation, a bit like stating the obvious to a group of psychologists. But often implicit within this theorise is that we're trying to understand here as attributes of people. But perhaps more explicitly, we're often seeking to identify how some groups of people differ relative to others. So the research might consider, as I said, for example, how activists or protesters are different to sympathizers and bystanders. And in this second question too, you can see a focus on how some groups of people focus on particular forms of tactics, whereas others might adopt different forms of tactics. So it's people, but it's also subgroups of people. And I think this is even more explicit still potentially when you start to look at some of the kind of conceptual models that exist in this space. So on the left there, I've got a figure from Wright, Steve Wright, who says, well, first there's the decision to be inactive or active, then you can choose individual or collective action, and then you can choose contentious action or non-contentious action. The two pyramids model by Moskolenko and Macaulay, and various other kind of pyramid models of radicalization basically suggest that there are these subgroups of people. And really the thing I want to say here is that most of our methods, though, use variable-centered technique to test theories that are about subgroups of people. So in what I want to talk to you about today, I want to talk about, I guess, the utility of an alternative approach. This is person-centered statistical methods and how they differ from traditional, that is, variable-centered approaches. And then I want to talk about my own work in terms of, I guess, just trying to make a case for them being useful additions in our toolkit. And they're useful because they help us address contemporary questions about collective action and social change. So before I do that, as I said, I'm not going to go heavy on the methods. What I do want to do, though, is talk briefly about how the two approaches are different, because I'm going to say, honestly, it took me a little while to wrap my head around how they basically, the two approaches model variance quite differently. And I think it's worth understanding some of the foundations of that so that you can appreciate, but again, sort of begin at developing appreciation of how they might be useful. So variable-centered approaches are ones that we're very broadly kind of probably all familiar with if you're familiar with kind of quantitative research in psychology and also the social and behavioural sciences. So ANOVAs, regressions, structural equation models, these are the dominant approach within a kind of a quantitative social and behavioural science. And of course, the challenge of a variable-centered approach is to explain variance between variables of interest. So, for instance, in this area, perhaps how social identification and intention to social identification might predict intention to engage in collective action. And these are really useful and appropriate approaches when you're investigating questions and hypotheses about how one variable might affect another one. So we might be interested in the relationship between commitment to a group and intention to engage in collective action. And again, I guess, need to say too much about that. These are things that we're quite familiar with from a traditional quantitative statistics kind of approach. Variable-centred approaches, though, are an emerging approach within social and behavioural sciences. I mean, they're certainly gaining traction at pace. And rather than modelling variation within, I guess you could say, a particular item or a scale, it identifies the existing or emergent subpopulations within a broader sample. So rather than assuming that you've collected some data, and a variable-centred approach would model that data as if it came from the same underlying kind of distribution or population. The first step of a person-centred approach is actually to ask, is this all one homogeneous population, or are there some meaningful subgroups within this broader population that we can identify using, particular indicators that might help us tease apart? And really the goal then of these kinds of approaches, and they're appropriate, where your goal is to categorize a sample into subpopulations or types as well, based on a chosen set of variables. So those subpopulations, so think back to what I was saying a moment ago about activists or radicals, can then be explored using predictors and outcomes. And that's the basic kind of premise of them. So it's still a quantitative approach, of course. It still relies mathematically on a structural equation modelling kind of framework. But rather than looking at variation and difference between outcome variables, it models patterns across people and looks at where patterns of people are similar on a set of variables, and there maybe can be differentiated from other groups of people. And my early caveat here, of course, even though I'm talking about person-centred approaches, in a way that sounds a bit derisive of variable-centred approaches, it's really not the case that one approach is inherently better than another, but that really, I think a key thing here is that methods should have fit with conceptualization. And when you're talking about activists or radicals or sympathizers or whatever it is, that then, you are using person-centred terms there, and therefore, exploring or investigating some of those using person-centred analyses can be a highly appropriate thing to do. So with all of that being said, and I actually should add the caveat, like I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a statistician, and I often say to my students, I feel like I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really explain mathematically in any sort of equation type sense how these things differ. So I will point you to some resources at the end where you could look up those kinds of questions. So please don't ask me about the maths. So it's my plea to you. But what I am going to then talk to you about today, my three propositions really are that the methods can help us to identify and distinguish the underlying groups in terms of how people orient towards collective action for social change, and I guess the diversity within a given population in terms of how people might start to think about social change. So I'll talk about some work we've done around givers versus actors, sympathizers, activists and radicals, and slacktivists. I'm using all of these, slacktivists versus genuine activists. So that's the first kind of piece. The second piece is really around how the methods might help us to understand volatility in collective action. And so really trying to move beyond a kind of a really static snapshot of how things might be happening or represented within a population at a particular point in time, and trying to think about, change and heterogeneity in terms of how things might look over time. And then the third proposition is really around how the methods can help us to identify and explain distinct trajectories of action over time. That is, those who increase, stay the course, walk away. And I'll be talking there about some work that I've done in the context of the movement to end global poverty. So that's kind of where we're headed. In terms of and as I've sort of said, I'm going to keep the narrative quite high level. I'm not going into heaps of detail about the maths or even the analysis itself. But within a mixture modelling type approach, and mixture modelling is a kind of a generic term for capturing all person-centred analyses, where actually it's quite apt in a lot of ways, because I say to people sometimes when you can think of latent profile analysis is a little bit like making a cake, and maybe your cake gets a bit lumpy and you have a particular type of lump that's more sort of strongly flavoured by some ingredients than another. But the general approach is first, you ask the question, are there meaningful subgroups that together comprise the broader population? And that's where latent profile analyses and growth mixture models help to answer, well, actually, is there heterogeneity in this data, or is it accurate to empirically describe this sample, whatever sample you've gathered, as sort of one big group who are relatively homogenous, or are there subgroups? And when that happens, group membership or the type or the profile then becomes a latent, that is an unobserved categorical variable that you can then model and look at how that variable is predicted or explained or differentiated by other variables. And so here my goal was to use theoretical insights derived from the literature on the social psychology of collective action to look at what explains membership of one profile or one trajectory over another. And this mixture modelling approach allows you to model the effects of a predictor and outcome variables on those profiles. So I know that sounds a little bit, for people who aren't familiar with the methods, that probably just all sounds like very strange and unfamiliar. But again, I'll talk you through a little bit more about what this kind of looks like in practical terms. Before going any further, I also wanted to acknowledge my collaborators who have worked on this work with me over the last few years. And I think I'll actually very briefly pause there and check whether there are any questions just before I start sort of trying to convince you with my 3 propositions. And I'm unable to see the chat, so I might just get Fouad to yell out if there are any questions there at the moment, or whether everyone's just happy for me to proceed.
None so far.
Brilliant. Okay, so far so good. It's not late in the evening. It's approaching 7 o'clock at night here, so it's not late, but yeah, when you're not quite sure whether or not you're making sense. So if anything, if I'm saying anything at any point you're not clear on what I'm trying to say, please feel free to reach out. Okay, so proposition 1 really then is around using these kinds of methods to help us identify and distinguish the underlying groups in terms of, the variety of ways that people can respond to, for instance, in the context of the work I wanted to talk to you about first, for instance, the inequality and disadvantage experienced by people in developing countries in the global south. So, for instance, right back when I started my research career around 20 years ago, the Make Poverty History movement was still quite prominent. And the thing that really uniquely differentiated that movement that actually I don't think we've seen in the international justice context since was a really strong focus around systems of inequality and how, how structures of international structures really perpetuate the ongoing disadvantage of people in some countries. So it had a very strong emphasis on that kind of systemic awareness of the origins of injustice in the context of international aid and development. And that really didn't exist in a lot of people. And so I was really interested in the distinction between people who might engage with the disadvantage experienced by people in developing countries and see that as an issue for political engagement and take collective action to pressure the government, march, rally, petition, all the sorts of things that we would talk about as traditional forms of collective action to really advocate for stronger targets on delivering aid and delivering, particular kinds of aid, versus people who maybe seek to bring about social change but have a theory of change that involves them being benevolent and I guess supporting change through what could be thought of as kind of mass generosity or this kind of collective giving. So if you donate sufficiently to NGOs, that money will flow through to support people in developing countries. Of course, there's more I could say about that kind of distinction as well, but that was the broad distinction I was interested in initially. And the thing that I guess I started, the observation that we started with there was that people can share the same social change goals, but arrive at very different conclusions about the most effective means of achieving that change. And perhaps these orientations could therefore be detectable using this form of analysis that I wanted to talk to you about. So I partnered with members of Australian anti-poverty organisations, and this became a large longitudinal survey that I conducted, and we asked them how often they did things like donate, how often they do engage in other behaviours, basically with the purpose of trying to combat global poverty, so petition, lobby MPs, attend rallies, posting in social media. And these then became, in the latent profile analysis, the indicator variables. And that means it was these actions that I used in the mixture to look at people who maybe were high across all of them, or just high on some of them. And I was really interested in what were the latent subgroupings of all of those kinds of behaviours that might exist within a sample of people who were already supporters of ending poverty. And then, assuming that there were differences or subgroup differences within that community, I was interested in then what might predict or explain variation in those different subgroups. And so the participants in our study completed measures of appraisals, basically who's to blame for global poverty, the emotions that they feel about that disadvantage, social change beliefs, so really kind of implicit theories in a way around how social change is enacted, and their level of commitment to ending global poverty in the form of their commitment to opinion-based groups. So I conducted a latent profile analysis, and I found that a two profile solution kind of had good fit with the data. And of these two groups, there was a group of people who comprised 90% of the sample, because the population that I had sampled from had predominantly come through World Vision Australia mailing list, so a very strongly donation-oriented NGO. And so most of the samples fell into that profile, and this sample engaged in high levels of charitable giving, but basically rarely engaged in any other form of action. And then there was a small but really, to me, very interesting subgroup of the sample who we termed activist supporters, and they were 10% of the sample, and they engaged in a raft of socio-political actions as well as donating. So these were people, it wasn't a case of either or. These were people who were doing all of those things. And then when we looked at what differentiated those two groups, they made very different attributions for global poverty and why it exists. And I mentioned before that I was interested in this idea that really came from the Make Poverty History movement, that international exploitation is to blame for the disadvantage that people in some countries experience, and that then implicates people in developed countries in terms of being part of a solution, because our governments are part of the problem. On the other hand, though, the benevolent supporters tended to make they weren't attributing blame towards the disadvantaged group members themselves, but they were blaming nature, corruption, and war. So they weren't blaming kind of as systemic forces in the same way that the activist supporters were. So we thought that was really interesting. Consistent with that kind of, I guess, more politicized understanding of what created the inequality in the first place, the benevolent supporters tended to be more strongly predicted by sympathy. Activist supporters were differentiated by outrage. And they had really quite different beliefs about the way that change is brought about on this issue. So benevolent supporters had this kind of theory around donating and donating as part of a collective social change strategy, whereas activist supporters, which in a sense is really a band-aid if the structural kind of systemic forces that maintain that inequality are not addressed. So activist supporters had that far more sort of politicized social change beliefs. Both groups were strongly identified, but the activist supporters, I should say, strongly identified in kind of mean terms. So they were both well above the scale midpoint in terms of their levels of social identification. However, the activist supporters were more strongly identified than the benevolent supporters, and that makes sense just in terms of the kinds of actions that they were engaging in the very concerted things that they had reported that they were doing. So that was our first study. In a second study, we looked at, I guess, a similar kind of approach, and we were interested in the many ways that people can respond to the systemic abuses of non-human animals. This was work funded through the animal charity evaluators. So if you think about, if you're concerned about animal justice, animal welfare, you can make changes to your own patterns of consumption. So you can become a vegetarian or a vegan. You can lobby for changes to legislation, so engage in the kind of activist activities that we were just talking about a moment ago. And, again, that really appeals to structures to bring about change, whereas your own patterns of consumption is, of course, about a theory of change that involves putting pressure on producers because you're not buying it anymore. Or you could essentially go to the source of the harm itself, and you can engage in illicit investigation and direct rescue. And again, this is what might be thought of as radicalism. But of course, and this is where my point about the people side of things comes in, as opposed to a variable-centered approach. So a variable-centered approach might look at the things that predict those three forms of behavior as separate kind of things. But of course, people can engage in more than one form of action at any given point in time. And we know that, for instance, most radicals probably are vegan as well, or identify as vegan. And so it's really not the case often that people think, well, I can only do that radical thing, and if I'm radical now, I'm not activist anymore. People engage in a raft of actions, and these kinds of methods are laid to look at where you've got subgroups of people who are doing things that they have in common but are different to other subgroups of people. So that's what we did with this research. So we sampled a whole bunch of people that were recruited through MTurk. We oversampled particular areas of the US where we understood that there would be kind of populations who were more strongly, I guess, predisposed to action on these issues. And we asked them that the actions that they had taken to support animals that, as I said, could be kind of personal or I'm going to say personal actions, still part of a social change philosophy that they're engaging in with other people, but it's more to do about, I guess, one's personal patterns of consumption or diet. So reducing or removing meat from diet, their political actions, so signing petitions, attending rallies, and then their radical actions in terms of investigating cruel practices within factory farms. So those were the indicator variables. And as I said, just those self-reported items we thought could be used to indicate, latent combinations of people who were vegetarian and radical, activists and radical. So that's what we were kind of interested in. And then we were interested in assuming that there are subgroups here and that most people, sit somewhere in some of those actions. Or of course, a huge group of people won't do anything, but we'll get to that in a second. Well, the things that should differentiate those subgroups should be the sorts of things that we know about from the psychology of kind of collective action and social change. So social identification, seeing who you are as a vegetarian or a vegan or a supporter of animal rights. Also really interested in this idea of solidarity with animals that came out of some work Catherine Amiot had been doing. Markers of politicization, so Simon and Klamderman's sort of really prominent model of how people develop that more politicized awareness. Well, people who are more politicized in terms of their understandings of the structural kind of causes and consequences of inequality and injustice, that should predict people who are doing more overtly political things. Markers of radicalization in terms of some of the literature suggesting that people will become radicalized when they perceive that the authority is failing. And also then we also have the social change beliefs, so the beliefs about the best way to achieve change. So coming back to that kind of two-step approach that I talked about a few moments ago. So we conducted a latent profile analysis, and the first step of that of asking is, well, are this population actually all the same in terms of their variation, or are there meaningful clusters of subgroups of people in this population, maybe some who are doing some forms of action that are different to others, but It's about looking at where people are similar, but then different to other people across those indicator variables rather than being limited to one variable. And we found that 71% of the sample identified as, or we actually the real, I would say the real creative part of a latent profile analysis is a little bit like a factor analysis, where you have to try and describe who these people are in terms of the things that make them different to other groups. So 71% of the sample were what we termed ambivalent omnivores. So they occasionally limited their own consumption. They were moved to purchase humane products and discuss the topic with friends and family. So they were kind of nominally sympathetic, but they were otherwise inactive and didn't do any of the other kind of behaviours that might be looked for there. We had a group called lifestyle choice activists who limited their consumption of animal or meat products relatively frequently. So they were mostly vegetarian, but they also reported signing petitions, sharing information through social media, and donating. So they had a very kind of political, but also a very personal practices orientation towards the issue. And then there was a third sample who we termed vegetarian radicals, who basically often or primarily limited meat and animal products. So this group ate very little meat or consumed very little meat and animal products. They donated to campaigns, signed petitions, but they also reported attending sit-ins, participating in rescues and investigations to reveal cruelty. So this group were doing some of the things that could be thought of as a bit more radical in this space, where, you know, you're talking about going onto properties and you know, freeing chickens and then adopting them out, that kind of thing. So they were a small group, a very small proportion of our sample, but you would expect that because that's a relatively less common behaviour. But it was still exciting to me to show that we could detect that small subgroup of people who were doing some of those kinds of behaviours.
Sorry, Emma, we have a question.
Oh, yep, sure.
Just seemed relevant. So we have a question from Alfaz, who asks, how do we ensure ethical interpretation of these sort of subpopulations that we're identifying with the LPA?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the interpretation of the profiles is about, I guess it's about where they are in terms of their agreement that they're, I don't know, endorsing a particular thing. The ones I'm talking about at the moment are about actions. I mean, ethical interpretation, it sits with the researcher, but I guess that's where you've got peer review as well. And the labeling is potentially, you know, it's potentially really fraught, as you'll see, because it can sometimes be hard to identify terms for the subgroups that don't sound pejorative, or you pick a group that, you know, you pick a set of labels that describe one group in order to differentiate how they're different from other groups. But yeah, you need to be really careful not to start sounding kind of pejorative or dismissive of one group as well. So that's something that it's really important to keep in mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I guess, where was I? I was just going to say, I guess perhaps unsurprisingly, these different groups kind of felt variable levels of commitment to identities that would have underpinned some of these very different kind of orientations towards how you would address animal justice. And whereas the people who are engaging in more political forms of action have, I guess, were higher in those markers of a kind of very politicized awareness of you know, the status quo and the need to convince third parties. And then the more radical group were higher in justification of extreme measures as necessary to end the plight of animals that exist in factory farms. So the subgroups had quite different, but again, theoretically explicable understandings of the intergroup context. They also had different kind of sets of beliefs around how social change should be brought about on this issue. So a generalized kind of political efficacy, didn't really differentiate any of the profiles, but what did differentiate the profiles is a sense in which we can bring about change on this issue, and that positively predicted people who are engaging in kind of political stuff, but it negatively predicted people who were engaging in more illicit sort of direct forms of action. And that's consistent with work that Nicole Tausch and colleagues kind of presented as well, that people, you know, who come to endorse these out of system, to use that terminology, forms of action, often do so because the mainstream or conventional system is failing them in some way. So this is a question that I guess was asked a lot in the mid-2000s, but isn't this all, you know, all of this kind of protests and contention, isn't this all just slacktivism? So you've got people reporting these forms of action, but is it really genuine? Is it really sincere? And of course, for those who kind of missed that critique, the slacktivism critique came primarily really from conservative commentators who were trying to deride or otherwise dismiss the contributions often of more progressive kind of activists. So the selectivism critique was basically, it arose in the context especially of online action, to say that people who are engaging in action are doing so for self-serving reasons or because they're too lazy to engage in more concerted high-risk forms of action. Colleagues within social psychology, though, took a more kind of nuanced look at this and really started to then ask questions about the underlying quality of ally motivations and I guess what you know, I guess with an awareness of the power structures often within any kind of group who is agitating for change, what that might look like in terms of understanding the variation in ally motivations. So colleagues Kutlaka and Radke started to talk about this idea of performative allyship, so people who are engaging in easy and costless actions that often don't challenge the status quo and are motivated by a desire to accrue personal benefits. Pietri and colleagues published a paper recently about effective allyship and argued that authentic motivation is key. And so really, I think with Lizette Yip, we became interested in sort of trying to understand these debates about the underlying quality of ally motivations. And naturally, I guess this won't surprise you to hear this, but we were interested in using person-centered approaches to understand, I guess, the underlying quality of motivation and people who engage in a movement for different reasons and have different motivations. So we incorporated in this work the insights of self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is a model of kind of human motivation, and it basically posits that there, for any given behaviour, that there can be a variety of motivations that people can engage in. Down the most kind of externalized end are these motivations that we would think of probably more in keeping with you know, the kind of the slacktivism critique or performative allyship reasons. So people who might be engaging in collective action for social change because they're trying to manage some aspect of their personal reputation, or they'll, you know, feel bad if they don't. And these are called externalized motivation in self-determination theory. And those were contrasted with more motivational forms that were understood to be more reflect a more internalized motivation. So people who engage in action because they want to change the world, they're passionate about human rights. And one really interesting aspect of self-determination theory is that the most pure internalized form of motivation in self-determination theory is intrinsic regulation, which is where something becomes inherently enjoyable and fun. But of course, when you look at what that might look like in the collective action context, protesting is fun, that sounds pretty off. So we basically almost never find that this form of motivation characterizes people who are genuinely engaging in collective action. And I don't think I need to explain too much about why that's the case, but nevertheless, within the theory anyway, these are all forms of internalized motivation. And what we thought was really quite useful around this kind of theoretical statement is, you know, you can think about this form of motivation as reflecting, I guess, a slacktivist critique. And then, dearie me, got to go through all of these. I forgot about that. And then up here, you've got, I guess, what would theoretically, in terms if you were to apply the pure insights of the theory, say, well, these are people who are doing it because they are so passionately committed to the cause that it becomes an inherently satisfying and important thing for them to do. Oh dear, here we go. Let's see. So in some research that we published in the British Journal of Social Psychology, we were interested to understand this debate and really understand, I guess, the subgroupings around the underlying quality of motivation. And we looked at that in the context of two studies looking at support for refugees. Study one was some data collected in September, October around the Syrian refugee crisis. And study two was about Ukrainian refugees, and the data was collected between December 2022 and May 2023. In both cases, we collected data from a number of different countries, and we really only examined the data from people who self-identified as supporters of action to support refugees, because again, this is about, well, the debate anyway really was around understanding the quality of motivation for people who do engage. So we selected participants for this research anyway who self-identified as supporters of refugees. Across 9 samples, and actually, so that's probably what I was meant to say on the last slide, we asked about their self-reported motivations for engaging in action to support refugees. We also asked about their level of social identification, some of their relevant emotions, and the kinds of actions that they do take to support in their activism. But across 9 samples, and in these 2 contexts and thousands of participants, we did not find a pure kind of slacktivist or virtue signalling or performative allyship profile. Rather, and this was actually kind of controversial within the tenets of self-determination theory, there was subgroups who had mixtures of motives really across those variety of motives. And it was where people tended to have those mixed motives that they were the most committed to action. So they saw it as the most important part of who they were, and they were the most engaged, and they had self-reported the most collective action. So this was interesting because self-determination theory posits that having a more extrinsic or externalized form of motivation should crowd out a pure motivation. And I guess in terms of some of the theory within collective action, the propositions there were, well, you need people who are engaging for pure reasons, and these data suggested that actually having some of the more externalized reasons alongside also certainly didn't harm people's self-reported commitment either. So that was quite an interesting set of findings for that one. So that rounds out proposition 1, which is my sort of most exhaustive proposition. So really the methods help us to identify and distinguish the underlying groups. So I talked about some work we've done around givers and actors, sympathizers, activists and radicals. And really this is about, well, how people engage and the subgroup differences in how people engage, and using the methods to try and provide a bit of a map for how people can engage in bringing about social change in qualitatively distinct ways for reasons that probably relate to their implicit theories of social change and how they attribute explanations for inequality and injustice. And these things kind of made pretty explicable in terms of some of the subgroups that we found, but also why people engage in terms of, the motives and some of the debates that have raged around the motives of people who engage in collective action. And that, therefore, is the first bit. And so really it's, this is a figure that we published in a paper recently, that if you think about, any number of the subgroups who might support or oppose change on a given issue, within those subgroups, you would have people who engage in all kinds of different ways, using violence, non-violence, through donation, giving versus socio-political action, people who are sympathetic but disengaged, people who are ambivalent and uncertain, people who are just completely apathetic and disengaged. And these are all different subgroups that that could be detectable potentially through using the methods. And really, I guess what the research that I've just talked about could be thought of as a bit of a snapshot or a moment in time. And these methods, and you can use any kinds of things. Well, you need to use obviously your theory or insights about what might allow you to distinguish a activist from a sympathizer, or whatever it is. But they act really as quite static snapshots or moments in time. My second proposition really is about how those things are also volatile. And I'll stop there and pause for questions.
Yes, thank you. We have two questions. The first one from Samaher. Do you have any ideas about how these quantitative approaches could be implemented in mixed methods research?
I do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, in proposition 2, I'm going to talk about some research that we did recently where we asked people to talk about how they saw the future, and we used latent profile analyses on particular quantitative indicators, but they had also written things around how they saw the future, which we analysed. But that was also that was qualitative data in a way, or it could have easily have been qualitative data. So I definitely have thoughts about that, and that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, and similarly, Agnieszka asks how people move from one identified subpopulation into another. Have you studied the dynamics of that shift in membership over time?
That's so awesome. And so, that's really what brings me to proposition 2 and proposition 3, is that, of course, what I was just talking about was a snapshot. It was, it was just a moment in time, but a latent transition analysis actually allows you to look at whether the subgroups change, and then you can model the things that maybe drive someone into one subgroup relative to another and those kinds of things. So that's partly what I'm going to talk a little bit about now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. So, like beautifully, I guess, picking up on those great questions. The second proposition really is the methods can help us understand some of this volatility, because collective action for social change is volatile. And of course, we often treat collective action, or, the variety of things that people can do to try and change the societies of which we're part, as a static thing that arises because of social change. But of course, it's also trying to produce social change. And there's a kind of an implicit feedback between collective action, social change, and vice versa. And those two things, I think, really, need to be engaged more deeply. And I know that's something that Fouad's keen to look at as well. But we took some steps towards thinking about this really in terms of, well, okay, once a person has engaged in collective action, what are the kinds of things that might be outcomes of having engaged in collective action? And we were interested really in an idea that was developed by my colleague Winifred Lewis, as this idea that when you engage in particular forms of collective action, that can be conventional or radical, you'll keep going if that action is held to be successful. So if you've engaged in some form of conventional action and it's successful, or you perceive that it's seeking to bring about the kind of change that you seek, then you'll keep engaging in that kind of collective action. However, when a movement is experiencing failure, and of course, movements go through prolonged periods of kind of inertia and, repression, then effects are likely to be very heterogeneous. So on the one hand, you're going to get a lot of people who will just exit the movement. And I'm going to caveat, of course, this with saying the research that we've done here is really just in weird countries, so Western democratic countries. All of this would look completely different in repressive contexts. And I know there's some really great work that has looked at that as well. But so, where a movement is experiencing difficulties, it's struggling to achieve its aims, and it's, experiencing this kind of persistent failure, well, a group of people will give up and they'll disidentify and they'll exit the movement. Another group of people might say, well, no, this is really important. Like, we need to keep going. We must keep, engaging with action. with greater moral energy, with greater energy, and they might moralize and energize, which would lead them to engage in continued or even more concerted forms of perhaps conventional collective action. And a third possible path here is that people who are experiencing, I guess, failure and inertia of their conventional tactics might come to develop a kind of a more radical suite of tactics, really part of it is a strategy of innovation. That is, if you're doing something, you're very committed to achieving change, but it's not working, then that's when you will start to pursue other forms of action as part of a strategy of kind of innovation to try and bring about change for the movement that we need. So if this is the case, and particularly when people and groups and movements are experiencing failure, then we need methods that can identify subgroups of people who are responding in similar ways, but different to other subgroups of people. And again, this is where we think person-centered methods are really, really useful. So we tested some of these ideas in the context of the marriage equality postal survey that was held in Australia in 2017. Here's a bit of a timeline of the recruitment, but also the vote that we had. So this was a compulsory survey. Australia has compulsory voting. Every Australian citizen over the age of 18 was mailed a form to express their support for marriage equality or their opposition. And the campaign was ultimately, like the amendment was passed. So, and Australians overwhelmingly voted for marriage equality. So the campaign was a success for supporters, but people who had opposed marriage equality, they had experienced a failure. So what we did, and you can see we had longitudinal data. We sampled supporters at time 1, time 2, and time 3. And at time 1, we looked at what are the latent underpinnings on those disidentification, innovation, moralization, and energization variables. Again, how do these help us to understand who the subgroups are in these two communities? And as I said, we had both supporters and opponents. And what you see here is that before the announcement was made, so when we were actively, filling in the surveys and polling was in play, the two groups look really similar. There was this group, supporters and opponents both looked really similar. So there was this committed activist group, and there was a group of kind of moderates who were like quite identified, but moderate and high in innovation, moralization, and energization. But the two groups looked really quite similar. However, after the announcement, so the supporters had achieved a win and the opponents had, suffered a blow. So what this then looks like is for the supporters, they basically almost became completely unitary in terms of the latent subgroupings that exist within that supporter category. So you can see on the left there that 97% of supporters were describable in terms of being, they were very highly identified, so low identification. They didn't seem the need to innovate because, this conventional political process had achieved an outcome that they were looking for. And they were moderate to highly moralized and energized. And that was really most of the sample. There was this tiny but reliable subgroup who appeared in the latent profile analyses. But really what that looks like is a lot of uniformity and homogeneity in terms of this is one group that looks pretty much the same. Not so, though, on the other side. So the group that had experienced the loss, and again, we were interested in the ways that heterogeneity might look in terms of reflecting a fracturing within the movement. There were 4 different subgroups that kind of emerged there from that group after the vote. So there was a group of people, around 2%, who were very highly identified, didn't want to pursue other tactics and just wanted to continue to engage with this political process. That was only 2% of the sample. There was this innovator group, so people who were also highly identified, that is low in disidentification, and really wanted to pursue other forms of action, also with sort of a moralized energy. There was a group of moderates, and then there was this group of people who were kind of resigned acceptors. So they had basically, somewhat disidentified. They still saw it as a moral issue, but they had very low energy to do anything about it. So these were the people who were the kind of the walk-away group. And in terms of predicting the actions of those people at subsequent time points, so we went back and resurveyed these people 8 weeks later, it was the stay the course people and the innovators who reported intention to engage in continued conventional action, continued intention to engage in more radical forms of action to bring about the change, given that the formal political process had just, not worked for them, and saw it as justified to pursue some of those more radical tactics. But really it was the innovators who 8 weeks later continued to see more extreme measures as a justifiable and necessary step in their pursuit of what they saw as a kind of a just outcome, and had reported that they were continuing to engage in collective action. So that was interesting because we used the method then to show that there was this idea that, failure is fracturing, and we could show that really quite kind of dramatically in terms of the underpinning profiles. I talked a bit about this a moment ago, but really social change is about collective action. When people engage in collective action, they do so because they are seeking to change the societies of which they are part. And we recently have been doing some work around how people see the future in relation to how that motivates them to act in the present. So social change is or can be about how people see the future, but we also know that not all future-oriented thought is equally effective in eliciting engagement for change. And there's some really great work by Fernando Kashima and colleagues that looks at how people see the future in terms of its utopian or dystopian qualities, how that might motivate people to engage in action in the present. And they've got these ideas about sometimes when you can imagine a positive kind of almost idealized or utopian version of your society, that might make you more critical of things in the present and then therefore more likely to engage in action to bring about that change that you see. On the other hand, Fernando Kashima and colleagues have also suggested that, sometimes those visions of the future could almost be quite fanciful and people use them almost as a form of escapism without really mobilizing around change in the way that might be required. And so we were interested in exploring some of these ideas in some work that we published recently. This is work led by Morgana Lizio-Wilson. And here we used latent profile analysis to identify different types of utopian thinkers. So if there are these ideas that, how people see the future in terms of its desirable, possible qualities, but people might have different kind of variations of how sort of desirable, beneficial and possible those futures are. And they may also help us to understand variation in the ways that imagining the future can lead to action or inaction. And so we asked, this was actually secondary analyses of a whole bunch of experimental data in which we were trying to experimentally compare the effects of essentially thinking about a utopian future versus a present day reality. And it's some secondary analyses in which we use this method to really try and understand some very messy experimental effects, and that's all disclosed in the paper. But so we asked all of our participants to imagine a future USA, and we're really interested in how people saw the issue on the context of particular issues. So economic inequality, climate change, gun ownership. And so we had people who both wanted greater gun access, so gun rights activists, and also people who opposed gun ownership in the US. And we had both of those groups. We actually kind of smooshed across those different forms of action in the analysis. But we asked all of those people to imagine a future, and they first they self-rated the degree to which they had their written utopian thoughts on this issue had the following features: whether their future was desirable, whether it was beneficial, whether it was innovative, and whether it was possible. And these were 4 kind of characteristics of utopias according to some work by Levitas and other social thinkers, sociologists. And we used those to look at whether or not there were differences in how people saw the future on these particular issues. And of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, we also had their written context around what they had written about. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the first stop really is that we found that a three-profile solution fit with the data. So we had these change-oriented thinkers, this group we called ambivalent future thinkers and dystopian thinkers. So the change-oriented thinkers were basically the people who saw the future that they had imagined on that issue as highly desirable, highly beneficial, highly innovative, and we asked them to really write in ways like that were unconstrained from the present day reality, in keeping with that kind of idea of a utopia, and also highly possible. We asked people to think of the ambivalent future thinkers kind of around the scale midpoint. So they were just a bit more ambivalent about how desirable, beneficial, innovative, and possible it would be. And then the dystopian thinkers were a really interesting group because these were basically a group of people who had not been able to, who'd basically very explicitly not followed the experimental instructions, which were to imagine a desirable, idealized, kind of positive future in which change had been brought about. These were people who imagined a future that they didn't see was desirable. They didn't see as beneficial. They didn't see it as innovative, but they did see it as possible. So these were people who were probably really unable to engage with the task for reasons that I think a lot of us can probably understand as well. Perhaps unexpectedly in terms of the outcome measures, so we took measures of system justification, group efficacy, hope, identification as a supporter of change, and commitment to action. And as you would expect, change-oriented thinkers were higher in all of those things. Perhaps, the more committed and the more you see a future that is desirable and beneficial, then that would be, I guess, reasonably likely to be predictors of some of those outcomes. Dystopian thinkers were more angry, though, which was really interesting. And then I mentioned that we had also got their written kind of content in terms of how they saw the thing. And I think this is a completely fascinating and, a thing I'd like to think more about is how you can use some of these profile indicators to then look at the kinds of, all kinds of mixed methods in terms of how people see the world. And there's certainly nothing to stop you having derived the profiles from quantitative indicators, asking people qualitative questions and analysing those. We analysed their written content, though, using the linguistic inquiry word count program. We had a few hundred, and we didn't have the space in the particular article that we were writing to do a deep kind of qualitative dive into the language. But what that more computerized text analysis showed is that change-oriented thinkers and ambivalent thinkers used far more fairness language. So the way they represented that future was more strongly in terms of the fairness of that future, which we thought was really interesting. And the dystopian thinkers used far more hopelessness language, which again, I think really reflects that unique kind of subgroup in terms of these are a group of people who just can't see a positive future. So these different subgroups use quite different language when they talked about the future as well. So that brings me to my second proposition. Yep, perfect.
Yeah, the question is the indicator variables. Do you use standardized scales to build the model or to interpret the model? So if everyone is low on an indicator variable, would you still interpret the ones that are higher than mean as high?
Yeah, this is a good question. I am aware of people who do use standardization in interpreting LPAs. So you standardize the scales and then you can look at where subgroups are relative to each other. I've tended not to because I think it's interesting and important to know where people are in absolute terms. So if you've got a scale of 1 to 7 and 1 is I strongly disagree that this is a desirable future versus 7 is I strongly agree that this is a desirable future, I still think it's really interesting to know where people sit in their absolute terms of rejection, whereas you lose that nuance when you standardize. So, but I think it would be one of those things that you could make a decision either way in terms of what you're trying to get out of your analysis. That answers that question. So are you interested in understanding the subgroups relative to the other groups? And that's kind of part of what you're trying to explain when you have these analyses. Well, how is this group different to this group? But I also think you want to be able to characterize those groups in terms of their psychological reality. And if group A is a person who is absolutely, strongly agreeing with a series of statements, then I also tend to think that's useful to know about as well.
Did that answer your question, Anna? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions before I leap on to the third proposition? And I should say there should be heaps of time for questions at the end as well. So happy to take questions now and happy to take questions at the end as well.
There doesn't seem to be any more right now.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the third proposition then really is around how the methods can help us to identify and explain distinct trajectories of action over time. And it's kind of linked to the context point that I was trying to make a moment ago, which is that, people can perceive context in different ways. They can experience the trajectory of their movement in quite different ways. And these are things that might come up or be reflected in different subgroupings within a given population. But social change, there's obviously a really clear temporal aspect to all of this as well, which I also don't think we've really sufficiently engaged. And yes, social change, it's years, decades, it's centuries. Change takes time, and this sort of really strong temporal element is often not particularly well addressed, although it's been really great to see, more longitudinal kind of methods starting to become more prominent within the social and psychological sciences. So thinking about what I was talking about a moment ago, what would this look like if you're interested in understanding, how a movement might maintain momentum over long periods of time? Well, there are going to be people who will give up and walk away, and they might start at time one, say, just to think about this as a contoid, they start at time one, but they slowly diminish their commitment. Some people won't maintain or increase their commitment, and they can maintain or increase at all different kinds of levels of commitment. So this is the reference to rusted on activists. I think that might be a bit of an Australian thing, that idea that something gets rusted on. Tell me if that may not make any sense to anyone other than an Australian. But this is this idea that, these are people who will stay committed no matter what. And then, of course, the really fascinating thing that that I'm not aware of anyone having really addressed, but I would be really keen to look at with anyone else who was interested, is people may change in ways as well that are unlinear. That is, particularly when it comes to something like burnout, people may disengage for a period of time in order to protect their health and well-being, but they might re-engage again when there's some sort of change in a social context. And we see this all the time with social movements, where movements can go through a period of kind of, relatively less visibility, but then you get this huge outpouring of people. And that also, I think, is something that is explicable in terms of some of our theories and models. And so to just, explore some of these ideas in terms of what we talked about as trajectories of collective action, I returned to the sample that I mentioned right back at the beginning, which is I had this longitudinal sample of people who'd initially engaged, who were recruited through those anti-poverty organisations. And we went back to them every year for 5 years. And again, we asked them the same kinds of questions around how often they donate, petition, lobby MPs, attend rallies, post in social media, those sorts of things. We had the same measures around the kinds of emotions, group efficacy, and whether they saw themselves as a supporter of global poverty reduction. And instead of looking at the subtypes of the different kinds of actions to look at these, givers and actors, what we did with this work was looked at differences in subgroups of people who were changing in ways that were qualitatively distinct to other subgroups of people across that 5-year time frame. So we used these measures of action to model what I talked about as trajectories of action, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. And then we were interested as well in how different emotions that they have about experience about the disadvantage, the group efficacy beliefs, and identification as a supporter of poverty might predict or explain some of those actions as well. And these are obviously markers of the kind of SIMCA variable, SIMCA model. So we actually found two trajectories sort of had good fit with the nature of change in this sample overall. So the black line on the top there, they started very high. So this is where I think it's quite useful to know that absolute level as well as the relative, I guess, difference between these groups. So these were a group of people who started high. They reported engaging in quite frequent action. And at time one and over the 5-year time frame, they had a weak negative slope. So they slightly diminished in their action over the 5-year time frame, but they were still very, strongly committed relative to, I guess, the other group. And then the other group were also engaging in some forms of action and also maintained their action over time. And in fact, they weekly increased their action, but they were starting from a lower base. So these folks were perhaps engaging in a lesser amount of action at the outset, and then they steadily increased that. So these were the two groups of people who changed, and we didn't find any evidence. I was interested in is there a subgroup of people who are basically, I don't know, has a trajectory that looks like a V, like a quadratic kind of effect, or are there people who maybe engage and disengage at particular points in time? But we just didn't find any evidence for that in this sample. And I think that really reflects the realities of this particular context or movement, which is that it's really, in Australia anyway, been a really neglected, it's just completely it's complete apathy, I think I would say, in Australia. So there is very little contention. There is very little public debate about global poverty reduction. And I think these trajectories just reflect a lot of stability, basically, because that's the reality of this movement at this point in time in this country. But nevertheless, we still found that the trajectories were differentiated by the kinds of things that, again, kind of made sense to us in terms of things that might really sustain a high level of activism over a long period of time. So social identification as a supporter predicted activist support relative to benevolent support. Sympathy predicted benevolent support. So this suggests that it is sympathy is an important kind of sustaining emotional reaction for some groups of people. But the activists were predicted by both outrage in the present and hope for the future. And this is an idea that I've been really keen to kind of explore more, particular combinations of emotions might be really important for how people kind of initiate action. Maybe they're angry in the first instance, but then an angry hope allows them to sustain their action over time. So that's the end of my third proposition. And I guess I feel conscious that I haven't talked much about the how-to. We published a paper that actually this talk is based on a paper that we wrote and we published recently in Social and Personality Psychology Compass. And I've got a self-promoting reference to that at the end if you wanted to look up anything here. But so this table comes from that paper, and there are some references there that provide really good, accessible kind of explanations about any of these forms of analysis if you wanted to know more, and also links to code if you want to start having a play with it yourself. What does this mean for theory? Well, I think there is a really, to me anyway, I'm seeing an increasing emphasis in the theory on complexity, and I think this is really clear in a lot of the work that has been done, and even work that has come out of members of this group as well, that, beyond individual variables, we need to sort of understand how clusters of interrelated emotions, motives, beliefs define some groups of people relative to others. And this idea that I know Fouad's talked about around, systems and complex systems thinking around collective action and social change. And these, I think, models or this kind of approach does give us an interesting way of understanding how clusters of multiple variables, so rather than having to test for a 5-way interaction between any set of variables, it allows you to look at how those clusters can then change over time in responses to change in the social context. And so I didn't report any latent transition analyses, but those are definitely possible, and I'm aware of other colleagues that have started to use those as well. So that's really great to see. I think that there are some interesting implications for research translations. So efforts to affect social change really rest on identifying fault lines of group action, but these aren't always directly observable. And the key thing in this method is these are latent, not directly observable subgroups that, so it's an alternative way rather than trying to somehow create these kind of cutoffs or go to a group of people who you think, well, these are activists, even though a group of people maybe don't necessarily always identify in activist terms. But these methods are really useful in distinguishing those who support and oppose, bystanders, third parties, those who are going to use violence. And I think it actually has a lot of useful potential utility for non-government or activist organisations who might think about, like, this is what a marketing person would talk about as market segmentation. Like, if you've got a group of people and you know that they're inactive but they're sympathetic, you might want to approach them in a way that is somewhat different to someone who you're trying to elevate in terms of their commitment. And I think it definitely gives sorry, I've got 2 dogs here who have had to maybe start barking. And of course, I guess some of these subgroups are really difficult to reach in terms of, some of the people that are doing more risky things in terms of their efforts for social change. And this provides one way of at least trying to meaningfully study groups that are otherwise quite difficult to access. So Kurt Levine famously said there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And I would say that this is also a very good practical method. And we wrote about it. So just to shamefully self-promote, we wrote about some of these kinds of ideas in a paper that we published this time last year, I think it was, in Social and Personality Psychology Compass. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you so
You're on
much.
mute. Yeah, I was going to say, I've just quickly muted because I think all hell is about to break loose behind me because there's 2 dogs and 2 children that might be about to run through. So if I mute in a second, I'll be why.
Yeah, no worries. I don't think I can't hear anything in the background.
Great.
All right. Any questions, anybody? We had another question about sort of how to predict evolution of collective action over time. Is growth mixture modeling an appropriate method to identify subgroups that begin with high engagement and then subsequently decline? Isn't that what you already showed in one of your studies?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it's such an intuitive method, I think, for all of us that know that in any given movement there will be people who will maintain their commitment, but that probably won't be most people. I mean, and then there'll be people who fall away, but then people who fall away but re-engage. And this is a perfect method for basically asking the question empirically, at least, do those people exist in this data? Can we detect those people? You do need lots of time points. So the more complicated the kind of form of change, so this is like a cubic kind of function in terms of the maths, you need numerous data points. So I think it's like more than 5. And you just think about that to plot a cubic curve that looks like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's where it gets a bit tricky with some of the more complex forms of change. But yeah.
Irina is asking, could you recommend a scale that differentiates between performative and genuine activism?
I mean, I thought that the self-determination theory, I mean, we had problems with the theory, some of the strong theoretical claims that it makes, we didn't think were particularly well founded. But for a set of measures around why variation in why people engage, like I said, you need to ditch the intrinsic motivation ones, because there's something like, I find this pleasurable and satisfying, and no one who's strongly committed to to anything is going to self-report that. But
I suppose it would work if we were thinking about eudaimonic pleasure.
yeah, that's right, absolutely. And so that's kind of what that strongly internalized motivation is meant to reflect: a sense of meaning and purpose and alignment with identity and values. And I think that that's all, those are all things that make sense to us. But yeah, I think in terms of a variable-centered approach, so that our finding really was not that performative motives don't matter. It's just that we couldn't find a group of people who only reported those motives. They tended to report those motives alongside other forms of motives. And it may be, though, because we sampled supporters. So we sampled people who already identified as supporters of refugees. And so if you sampled a more ambivalent or disengaged group, then you might get that sample of people who are only reporting doing it for self-serving reasons. But we didn't find that in a group of people who are committed to change.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that's awesome, because there's this risk, right, of being essentializing or reductionist when you're profiling and classifying people. And if your data is showing, ambivalence and complexity in the psychology to begin with, then you have to be super careful with sort of the way you treat labels and what, to try not to be entitative about it.
Yeah, to reify them as well. Like they just reflect something at a particular point in time. And then this also poses a separate challenge in some ways, which is replication. So how do you replicate the findings of a latent profile analysis? Reviewers used to get really upset about things like having unequal sample sizes in your profiles as well. And again, depending on how open your reviewers are to the reality that most people are not going to fall neatly into 4 quadrants who are all 30 people in each cell, or whatever it is. So, but the methods tend to reflect the reality on the dimensions that you've asked it to assess variation in, and it's just a point in time reality that can change again. So when you get reviewers saying, if I did this again, would I find the same thing? Often the answer is going to be no, because things have changed within the context of a movement. But that is also like a thing that makes it diagnostic and rich. And that's partly what we tried to show with the paper that we published on the marriage equality movement, that when the context of a movement changes, that the latent subgroupings within a community change, and that makes sense.
Okay, we have three really cool questions. Agnieszka is asking, have you used any other methods than latent profile analysis for finding those groups? So, I mean, the LPA is a classifier. There are other kinds, a principal component, a K-core. Do you have any resources that could compare these different methods?
I haven't tried using a K-core cluster analysis. I mean, PCAs, again, that's where I kind of come back to are you modeling variation across variables, and where variation within a set of variables might differentiate this set of variables to that, versus variation across people. And so for me, conceptually, the way that the method models variation within a sample of people had a nice fit. So I have not really looked at any of those other resources, but I'd really be interested in finding out more about them. I mean, PCA I know about, core clustering. I don't know what's a K-core clustering. Is that like a cluster analysis, or is that something else?
Agnieszka, would you mind if I put you on screen to follow up with your question? Okay, great. One moment. Other. Damn Teams. Okay. Bring on screen. Okay, go ahead, Agnieszka. You're muted, Agnieszka. Oh, can't switch on your mic. Okay. That's too bad. All right. I guess maybe just
thank you. Yeah.
put it in the chat and
Yeah.
I'll read it out. Agnieszka, by the way, is giving a workshop in September for 2 days. So I'm sure she'll talk to us about some of those.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah.
So Ilya is asking, is there a way to empirically compare and maybe integrate data about subgroups identified using these methods? So they're asking about allies who engage in collective action and protagonist individuals of those movements, or those affected by particular oppressions.
So just to see if I'm understanding you, Ilya, are you asking about, so say you've got, so you've got data, and some of that data are about allies or people who are not, I guess, themselves directly affected by the disadvantage. And then you've got a group of people who are like disadvantaged group members, to use those shorthand terms. And then whether it's performative, genuine. So there'd be nothing to stop you using samples of those two groups. You're interested in the perceptions across the groups, as I understand it from your question. So how racialized individuals perceive motives of white individuals. I think you could definitely use the subgroups, but I think the method is most useful when you have reason to think that within a particular group, not everyone's the same in this group. And that certainly makes sense in terms of, for instance, like a white person group. So you'd have white allies, maybe white performative allies, white, genuine allies. And then you'd have a group of white people who are opposed to change maybe on the issue. So it's not even that they're allies, they're actively opposed to equality and social change. You could use the method to identify that. The thing that gets sticky about any of these is you need to have it clear in your mind what are the things that differentiate the subgroups in terms of those indicator variables. So I don't know that I've really answered your question, but I think the starting point would be to think about, I've got a sample, in what ways do I think that this sample might differ or clump together with subgroups?
Seems to me it might be more fitting with multi-group analysis.
Yeah, could be too.
So Anna's asking, do the organizations you partner with find the person-centered findings more useful than variable-centered?
Yeah, so certainly the finding from the most of the work that I've done on the global poverty reduction, and actually we integrated some of that as well with an examination of motives, and part of the reason that I was motivated to start thinking about some of these things was that they have in-house, like all of these NGOs and agencies often have their own implicit kind of models of who the subgroups are within their organisation and their community. And I remember seeing one at an NGO that I was, an anti-poverty NGO that I was sort of trying to work with, and they had a pyramid, a triangle. They were like, down the bottom here are most of our people who do less, but because there's so many of them, they are an important group for us to engage in a particular way. And then right at the top, you've got this tiny little group of people who, are extraordinarily kind of committed and motivated, but they're numerically few. And that idea that, you can detect those different groups. And then, if you're keen to try and engage them, then you might need to engage them in different ways. And that's, I think, something that's potentially very useful about the method. Yeah. See you, Anna. Lovely to see you. Well, see your name.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah, please.
Do you know what scope do you feel this method has moving forward into sort of a multi-level space?
So we did multi-group, which is a bit different to multi-level, but we did look at multi-group structural equation modelling in the refugee paper that Lizette Yip led at the British Journal, where we were interested in those different kind of qualities and motivations. And we were really interested in whether the different subgroupings differed across countries. And again, you can imagine that there are very different sort of socio-political realities for countries in terms of how they treat refugees. That might mean that even the quality of the motivation might differ. And so we did try to engage some of that in a way that was quite superficial, I guess, at a multi-group level. Tell me more about what you're thinking about a multi-level.
Well, I mean, so consider an example like you were just talking about, but you wanted to look at clusters among contexts that themselves sort of define certain patterns in the classes at the national level. So, for example, can you see post-colonial countries being clustered differently than, weird contexts, or Europeans different than American countries, or something like this, where you can have clustering happening sort of at a collective level, at a higher level than the data that you're using to cluster the population.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that in that level, but no, that sounds really interesting. I don't know how mathematically, or from a modeling point of view, you would do it. So yeah, with the multi-group version, all you can do is ask whether they're the same or different, whether the proportions of the subgroups are the same or different. But yeah, no, that's really interesting to think about that.
I mean, I guess it is absolutely reasonable to be using the classes as a variable at a group level, and to be able to predict those in a multi-level SEM, right? There's no reason we can't combine those methods.
Yeah, yep, I think you're right. And would you treat the level 2 or like the national level variable just as an observed predictor?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I imagine there would also possibly be cross-level interactions and predictions as well. I'm not so I don't have a specific sort of idea in mind. I'm just trying to explore sort of
explore some
the
possibilities.
possibilities.
Yeah. No, I think multi-group, I mean, the furthest I've got is a multi-group latent profile analysis where you can at least examine whether or not the latent subgroupings are similar or different. And again, you can imagine all kinds of reasons. It's fairly descriptive. And then I guess the other thing that I talked briefly about and someone did ask about is looking then at how people move across them over time. And if you could imagine can imagine that with the national level and then change over time, you'd have something pretty cool, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you'd start to approach more of a systems level.
Yeah, more
sort
of a
of under.
systems level. Yeah, yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you. Does anybody have any further questions for Emma? All right. Thank you so much. One last thing. Our next session will actually be very soon on Tuesday, June 2nd, next week. Ismail Puga and Cristobal Moya will show us their approaches to detecting the phenomenon of ideological inversion, which is postulated to be a factor in social inertia, and how to do that using structured and unstructured data. You can see the full schedule in our on our website. I will just put the links in the chat, and you can register for updates. And I'll send out an invitation to. I already sent out an invitation to Ismail's talk, but I'll send out a reminder today. Or if you'd like to review. If you can't attend any session, you can always go to our website and look at the archive recordings. So thanks so much again, Emma, and thanks everybody for being here. And I look forward to
Yeah.
seeing you in future sessions.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Have a nice day, week, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. You too.
Bye.
See you. Bye.